Is the Bible true? The historians who wrote about Jesus. Has there ever been a man from outside our universe with the answers to life that we seek? Has there ever been a superhuman life? That answer is yes, just one man. He lived over 2,000 years ago in the first century. Let's remember here that by the time of the first century, the writing of history was common. This man, named Jesus Christ, predicted in the Old Testament and the subject of the New Testament, was so extraordinary that his life was documented carefully by eyewitnesses and historians. We've looked at the eyewitness accounts. Now let's look at what some of the historians had to say about Jesus, so you can look them up for yourselves. Keep in mind as you read that many of these historians were hostile to Christ and his followers. Tacitus was the leading historian of Imperial Rome. He wrote this, quote, "The author of that name, Christian, was Christ, who in the reign of Tiberius suffered punishment under Procurator Pontius Pilate." That was true, for in 30 AD the Jewish leaders turned Jesus over to the Romans to be killed. Pontius Pilate had Jesus flogged and then crucified. His followers became known as Christians. Pliny the Younger was a Roman author and lawyer born around 61 AD. His books and letters give us an important picture of Roman life in the first century. Pliny wrote these words about having to try the cases of Christians. I quote, "Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted I ordered executed, for I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished." That was true. Great persecution started in earnest for the Christians after Jesus had died, and it lasted 3 long centuries. Tertullian was the jurisconsult in Rome. That meant he would have been familiar with the Roman archives. He wrote in chapter 5 of his Apology about Emperor Tiberius Caesar receiving intelligence from his outpost territory of Palestine about a man, Jesus Christ, being divine. Tiberius brought this intelligence before the Senate, fully convinced about it, but the Senate rejected his intelligence. This angered Caesar so that he then threatened death against all accusers of the Christians. This was true. Without the use of modern technology, the news of Jesus spread like wildfire. Palestine was at the very far edge of the Roman Empire, and so the news covered over 1,400 miles just by word of mouth and written reports. Josephus was a Jewish historian that wrote about Jesus in his book called Antiquities. I quote, "There was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day." End quote. The Jews and the leadership in particular had looked upon Jesus as a threat to their religion, but as a historian, Josephus had no choice but to report the facts he had been a witness to. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek philosopher. He wrote during the time Christians were being persecuted. He was adamantly opposed to Christianity, and yet through his writings he acknowledged much about Jesus as being true. For example, Celsus addressed the miracles of Jesus. He expressed no doubt that they happened, but he held that, quote, "Jesus performed his miracles by sorcery." This was quite similar to the Jewish Pharisees of Christ's time. They didn't dispute that Jesus had done the miracles, but they accused him of doing them by the power of Satan. The fact that historians from the known world at that time were writing about this man confirms that Jesus did live, and that what the Bible records about his life was history, recognized by men who had no interest in promoting Jesus as the Son of God. But now we want to ask, are there tests by which historians can evaluate a text for reliability? That answer is yes, and we'll look at the first test in the next video.